There is a pattern that every great empire has followed. They rise, they reach a peak that feels permanent, and then almost invisibly they begin doing the very things that will eventually destroy them. The British Empire did it, the Dutch Empire did it before that, the Romans did it long before either of them. And right now, in the 21st century, if you know what to look for, you can watch it happening again, playing out with a precision that is genuinely unsettling, across every continent on Earth. The country doing it is China. Now before you switch off, this is not a story about who is going to win some grand geopolitical contest. It is not designed to condemn or celebrate anyone. This is a story about patterns, about how power works, about how empires expand, and more importantly, about how they crack under the weight of their own ambition without ever realizing what is happening to them until it is already too late. Because here is what keeps getting lost in the noise of trade war headlines and diplomatic summits and congressional hearings. The people who are supposed to be paying attention are not connecting the dots. The politicians and the analysts and the commentators are debating individual moves without stepping back far enough to see the whole board. And when you do step back, when you hold the current map of China's global strategy next to the historical map of the British Empire at the beginning of its long decline, the resemblance is not vague. It is not a loose metaphor. It is structural. And it runs deeper than almost anyone in a position of power is currently willing to say out loud. So let us go back. Let us start where we need to start. In a Britain that had never felt more powerful, and which was, in ways its own leadership could not yet see, already beginning to lose. By the 1880s, the British Empire controlled approximately 1/4 of the world's total land surface. More than 500 million people lived under its direct authority, or within its sphere of influence. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. British banks were financing construction on every inhabited continent. British ships moved through every major ocean. And British administrators sat in government offices from Nairobi to Calcutta to Sydney, managing a network of territories that fed raw materials into the most productive industrial economy the world had ever seen. Now most people, when they think about how Britain held all of that together, think about the Navy, about military force, about the Redcoats, but that is not actually what held it together. What held it together was infrastructure. The British understood something that most historical accounts underemphasize. If you control the physical systems through which a country's trade must flow, the railways that move its goods, the ports that ship its exports, the telegraph cables that carry its communications, you do not need to station soldiers on every corner. The country builds its entire economic life around the structures you put there. It becomes dependent on those structures. And once that dependency is in place, political influence follows as naturally as water flows downhill. Between 1850 and 1950, the British Empire built approximately 120,000 kilometers of railway across 57 territories. They constructed more than 100 ports. They built the Shanghai to Nanjing Railway, the Kowloon to Canton Railway, the ports of Hong Kong and Shanghai. And they played a central role in financing the Suez Canal, the most strategically important shipping route between Europe and Asia. When Egypt's debts became unmanageable in 1875, the Rothschild family helped the British government acquire a controlling stake in the Suez Canal Company over a single weekend. One financial transaction. One weekend. And suddenly Britain held effective control over the movement of nearly all trade between two continents. That is what infrastructure as geopolitical leverage looks like when it is working at full power. And it worked in part because the countries receiving this infrastructure genuinely benefited from it, at least at first. The railways made trade faster, the ports made exports possible, the telegraph made communication across vast distances practical for the first time. Britain was not entirely wrong to describe this as development. The problem was that it was simultaneously something else. Something the receiving countries did not always understand until it was too late to change. It was dependency. A country that needs British-built railways to move its crops, British-built ports to ship its minerals, and British-managed cables to communicate with the outside world is a country that cannot simply change its political allegiances when the relationship becomes inconvenient. The infrastructure is already woven into its economic life. The contracts are already signed, the debt is already owed. And debt owed to a more powerful creditor has a way of converting what began as a financial relationship into something that functions much more like political control. Britain did not need to announce this arrangement openly. The arrangement announced itself. It announced itself whenever a debtor nation needed to renegotiate terms, whenever a port needed to expand and there was only one obvious financier, whenever a government needed to fund a new project and found that the only lender available was the one that had financed the last three. That is the mechanism. Hold it in your mind, because you are about to see it again. One more thing worth saying about how this system actually worked in practice. The British officials who built it did not think of themselves as building a trap. They thought of themselves as building the world. The engineers who laid track across the African interior believed they were bringing progress. The bankers who structured the Egyptian loans believed they were providing a legitimate financial service. The administrators who took control of customs revenues in indebted territories believed they were restoring order. The sincerity of those beliefs did not change what the system was. It only made it easier to build and easier to sustain, because the people running it did not need to maintain a fiction. They believed the story they were telling. And that is precisely what made British imperial dependency so durable and so difficult for the countries caught inside it to escape. In September of 2013, Chinese President Xi Jinping stood at a university in Astana, Kazakhstan, and announced what would become the most ambitious infrastructure investment program in the history of the modern world. He called it the Silk Road Economic Belt. Within weeks, he expanded the concept to include a maritime Silk Road stretching across the seas of Southeast Asia, through the Indian Ocean, and onward into the Atlantic and Pacific. Together, they would be known as the Belt and Road Initiative. As of 2025, the Belt and Road Initiative covers investment commitments for active projects in more than 150 countries. The participating nations account for nearly 75% of the world's population and more than half of global economic output. Roads, railways, deepwater ports, power plants, telecommunications networks, the specific infrastructure varies by country. The logic behind it is identical across every single one of them. Build the infrastructure that developing nations need, embed yourself in their economic lives, and convert physical connectivity into strategic dependency. China has spent or committed more than $1 trillion to this program. That number is almost impossible to comprehend in the abstract. But here is the context that makes it legible. Adjusted for inflation, the British Empire spent a comparable sum building its own global infrastructure network across the 19th and early 20th centuries. And the British did not describe that investment as an instrument of control either. They called it development. They called it progress. They called it the natural responsibility of a civilized power. And in specific cases, they were not entirely wrong. But they were never entirely right. The parallels between China's current strategy and Britain's 19th century model are not vague. They are precise enough to be uncomfortable. China's flagship port investment in Gwadar, Pakistan, mirrors almost exactly the logic behind Britain's acquisition of the port at Aden in 1839. A strategically positioned deepwater facility providing access to critical maritime routes and creating a node of economic dependency in a country already heavily indebted to the investing power. China's railway projects across East Africa, connecting landlocked regions to coastal ports, replicate the structure of British East African railway construction in the 1890s. Infrastructure that tied regional economies into export patterns serving the investors' interests as much as the recipients. China's telecommunications investments through Huawei and other state-linked companies, which have built or are operating significant portions of the mobile and broadband infrastructure across parts of Africa, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia, parallel the role played by the Eastern Telegraph Company, a British enterprise that by 1900 controlled the majority of the world's undersea cable network, and with it the flow of information across the entire British imperial system. None of this is accidental. Chinese strategic literature, including published documents from the People's Liberation Army and from institutions linked to the Chinese Communist Party, explicitly references the historical relationship between infrastructure investment and geopolitical influence. Beijing has read this history carefully. It is not repeating it by coincidence. It is also worth noting that China's approach incorporates something the British model eventually developed, but did not initially deploy systematically. The deliberate cultivation of institutional relationships alongside physical infrastructure. China's Confucius Institutes, embedded in universities across more than 100 countries. Its state media networks that have expanded aggressively across sub-Saharan Africa, offering local broadcasting partnerships that are technically sophisticated and inexpensive. Its training programs that bring African and Asian military officers to Chinese institutions. Britain built schools, legal systems, and missionary networks alongside its railways and ports. The tools are different. The function of embedding influence at multiple layers simultaneously is exactly the same. And like Britain before it, China is finding that the countries receiving this infrastructure often genuinely benefit from it, and that the benefit and the dependency arrive together, inseparably bundled. Easy to celebrate on the day the railway opens. More complicated to evaluate a decade later when the loan repayments come due. Here is where the comparison between British imperial strategy and Chinese global investment starts to become genuinely uncomfortable. Not because the mechanisms are identical in every technical detail, but because the outcomes they are producing bear recognizable resemblance to outcomes the British produced a century earlier. The British Empire, at the height of its infrastructure investment phase, was simultaneously managing an enormous portfolio of sovereign loans to the countries it was developing. When those countries struggled to repay, Britain was sometimes able to convert financial leverage into political control. Egypt in the 1870s is the clearest example. Britain became Egypt's largest creditor as Egyptian debt became unmanageable. It assumed control over Egyptian finances. And in 1882, it occupied the country militarily. The financial relationship had created the conditions for political absorption to follow. China is operating in a different world. It is dealing with sovereign nations in a system governed by international law and monitored by multilateral institutions. The specific mechanics of any pressure it might apply are necessarily different from those available to a 19th century imperial power. But the underlying dynamic, that very large financial dependency can, under the right conditions, be converted into political leverage, is not different in any way that history would find reassuring. Consider Sri Lanka's Hambantota port. China financed its construction. The port failed to generate sufficient commercial revenue to cover its costs. Sri Lanka, already under severe fiscal pressure, could not service its debt obligations. In 2017, the Sri Lankan government agreed to lease the port to a Chinese state-owned company for 99 years in exchange for $1.1 billion used to retire other debts. Now the full picture here is genuinely complicated and deserves to be stated honestly. Serious researchers at institutions including Chatham House have documented that the Sri Lankan debt crisis was primarily the product of the country's own fiscal mismanagement and its exposure to high-interest international sovereign bonds. China's loans represented less than 15% of Sri Lanka's total foreign debt at the moment of crisis. The simple narrative of a deliberate Chinese debt trap is an oversimplification, but here is what that more nuanced picture still does not resolve. A Chinese state-owned company is now operating a strategically positioned port in the Indian Ocean on a 99-year lease. Whatever the path that produced that outcome, the result is that China holds deep operational access to a critical node in one of the most important maritime corridors in the world. Britain would have recognized the logic of that result immediately, even if it could not have anticipated the specific path that led there, and Sri Lanka is not an isolated case. Djibouti sits at the entrance to the Red Sea, directly across from Yemen, at one of the most strategically important maritime choke points on the planet. A Chinese state enterprise acquired a stake in the port of Djibouti in 2013. Chinese companies built the Durali multi-purpose port. And in 2017, the People's Liberation Army formally opened what it described as a logistical support facility adjacent to that port. China's first overseas military base in the modern era of Chinese foreign policy. The facility covers 90 acres. It includes troop barracks, underground storage, helicopter staging areas, and a pier capable of accommodating large naval vessels. A 2024 report by the Center for Strategic and International Studies assessed that the base is being used to support intelligence collection directed at the United States and regional partners. Djibouti's external debt stands at 68% of its gross domestic product. More than half of that debt is owed to Chinese institutions. Now think about that sequence again. Infrastructure investment, port access, financial dependency, military presence. Replace the names and change the dates, and you have a description of how Britain positioned itself in Egypt, in Singapore, in Aden, in Hong Kong, port by port, railway by railway, across more than a century of imperial expansion. The instruments have changed. The underlying logic has not. In 2025, China inaugurated a joint military operations center at Cambodia's Ream Naval Base on the Gulf of Thailand. Senior American officials have formally raised concerns about this facility, noting that it gives China a strategic presence directly adjacent to disputed waters in the South China Sea. A 2024 Pentagon assessment concluded that China is actively seeking to expand its overseas logistics and basing infrastructure in order to project and sustain military power at greater distances from its own shores. That is the precise capability Britain spent the entire 19th century building. The ability to maintain force and presence far from home, anchored by a network of ports and facilities that converted geographic reach into geopolitical leverage. Britain called its overseas network coaling stations and naval facilities. The function was identical. There is a dimension of the British imperial story that almost never gets the attention it deserves, because it complicates the standard narrative of confident expansion, followed by sudden catastrophic defeat. The British Empire did not fail primarily because a stronger power defeated it. It failed because it built a system whose external scale exceeded the productive capacity of the domestic economy that was supposed to sustain it. And because it could not see that was happening until the contradiction had become irreversible. By the early 1900s, Britain was maintaining military garrisons, naval stations, and administrative infrastructure across territories on every inhabited continent. The cost of defending and governing that empire was rising steadily and significantly faster than the economic returns it generated. Britain's share of global manufacturing output had been falling for decades, from roughly 23% in the 1870s, to 13.5% in 1913, to less than 11% by 1938. Germany and the United States were outproducing Britain in almost every major industrial category, but Britain was still spending, still borrowing, still maintaining its global commitments. As if the domestic engine that had made all of this possible were still running at full capacity. The reserve currency status of the pound sterling masked this internal deterioration for longer than it should have. Because the world needed to hold pound sterling to conduct international trade, there was a constant global demand for British currency that kept borrowing costs low and allowed Britain to run deficits that would have forced any other economy into painful adjustment decades earlier. The pound's strength was not a reflection of British economic health. It was a lag, a residual function of historical dominance providing a temporary cushion between the reality of decline and the political acknowledgement of it. When the two world wars arrived in rapid succession and the costs of Britain's global commitments came due all at once, the gap between the appearance of power and the substance of it could no longer be ignored. By 1945, British public debt stood at approximately 200% of gross domestic product. A country that had entered the 20th century as the world's largest creditor nation left the first half of it as its largest debtor. The pound devalued. The empire dissolved. Not in defeat, in exhaustion. Now look at China's internal economic position in 2025. China's property sector, which at its peak accounted for as much as 30% of total economic output when all related industries are included, has been in sustained crisis since 2021. Major developers have collapsed. Real estate investment fell approximately 10% year-on-year in the first quarter of 2025. Home prices have continued to decline across smaller cities. China recorded 2 consecutive years of deflation through 2024. The first time that had happened to a major economy outside Japan since the 1960s. Youth unemployment remained above 17% through the second half of 2024, and household savings surged to 55% in 2024, the highest recorded since 1952, as families frightened by economic uncertainty sharply cut their spending. In late 2024, Chinese authorities launched a 10 trillion yuan debt restructuring program equivalent to approximately $1.4 trillion to address the accumulating hidden debt crisis in local government financing vehicles, which the International Monetary Fund had estimated at 46% of gross domestic product in 2023 alone. This is not the picture of an unstoppable ascending power. This is the picture of an economy carrying serious structural problems. Deflation, a collapsing property sector, weak domestic consumption, demographic decline, and a debt load growing faster than the economic output required to service it. The Rodian Group, an independent research firm with a strong analytical track record on China, estimated actual Chinese economic growth in 2024 at between 2.4 and 2.8%, significantly below the official government figure of 5%. Whether the lower estimate or the official one is closer to reality, the directional trend is not seriously disputed. China's era of extraordinary growth is over, and here is where the British parallel becomes most pointed. Britain in the early 20th century was in a structurally comparable position. A nation with an enormous external footprint, extensive global financial commitments, and an accelerating domestic industrial decline that its reserve currency status was temporarily masking from its own political class. The pound kept the appearance of British power intact long after the engine driving that power had begun to fail. And when the moment came when that appearance could no longer be maintained, the transition was fast, painful, and irreversible. China is not in that position yet, but it is in something resembling the position Britain occupied perhaps 20 to 30 years before the collapse, a position that looks manageable from the inside and considerably more concerning to anyone who has read the historical record carefully. The deepest lesson of the British Empire's decline is not the one about military overextension, or debt, or the loss of reserve currency status. Though all of those are real and documented, the deepest lesson is about the nature of the trap itself. Britain did not fall into a trap that someone else set. It built its own trap, slowly, deliberately, over decades, in the very process of building the system that had made it the most powerful nation on earth. And that trap had 3 interlocking components that made it almost impossible to escape once all 3 were fully in place. The first was overextension. Every new territory, every new port, every new railway line added capability and also added obligation. The empire required constant expansion to justify its costs, and every expansion increased the total burden of defense and administration. The returns diminished as the scale grew. The cost did not. The second was the masking effect of reserve currency status. The pound sterling gave Britain an economic privilege so significant that it obscured the deterioration of the underlying productive base that had originally earned that status. Nations and institutions held pounds because it was convenient to do so. That global demand kept the currency strong, kept borrowing costs low, and allowed policymakers to delay structural adjustments that any other economy would have been forced to make far earlier. The mask held, until it did not. And when it came off fast. The third component was cognitive. The British political class, the institutions, the think tanks, the diplomatic service, all of the analytical machinery of a sophisticated imperial state consistently interpreted the warning signs in ways that explained them away rather than confronting them. This was not stupidity. It was a predictable feature of how powerful institutions process information that threatens their core assumptions. The empire had worked for so long, had generated such extraordinary wealth and prestige, that the emotional and institutional investment in its permanence was simply too great to permit honest assessment of its fragility. Now consider what is not happening in Washington. The American political conversation about China is largely tactical and transactional. There are serious debates about semiconductor export controls, about trade tariffs, about military posture in the Western Pacific, about the security implications of specific Chinese technology platforms. These are not unimportant debates, but they are debates about individual moves in a much larger game, not about the game itself. The question that is not being asked loudly enough or seriously enough in the places where it would matter is whether China is currently executing a recognizable historical template for imperial overextension, one with a well-documented structural logic and a well-documented endpoint, and whether understanding that template would change how the next 2 or 3 decades are navigated. That conversation is happening in academic journals, in certain think tank publications, in a small number of policy papers that rarely reach the floor of Congress. It is not happening at the level where the answer would produce different decisions. Part of the reason is that China's version of this template genuinely differs from the British original in ways that make direct comparison complicated. Britain was a colonizing power in the explicit, legal, and brutally material sense. It claimed sovereignty over other people's territories, displaced populations, extracted resources, imposed governance by force, and constructed the entire system on a foundation of violence that was not incidental to its success but constitutive of it. China's current expansion operates under different international norms with different instruments and under different constraints. It does not claim sovereignty over the countries receiving its Belt and Road investments. It lends to them. It builds for them. It signs contracts with legitimate governments. The relationship is structured to look like banking rather than empire. But outcomes accumulate regardless of the framing placed around them. When more than a quarter of the world's bilateral external debt was owed to China as of 2023, according to the World Bank's international debt statistics, and when significant portions of that debt are owed by small politically fragile nations across Africa, Central Asia, and the Pacific, the question of whether a lender of that scale holds disproportionate influence over its borrowers is no longer theoretical. Kyrgyzstan owes China approximately 40% of its total gross domestic product. Tajikistan owes approximately 27%. Djibouti is formally assessed as being in debt distress by the International Monetary Fund, with more than half of its external debt held by Chinese institutions and a Chinese military base sitting adjacent to its most important port. Whether or not you call this a debt trap, these are not relationships between equals, and the trajectory is not reversing. The Belt and Road commitments must eventually be serviced or restructured, and every restructuring negotiation is a political event that simultaneously generates resentment and deepens dependency. The military presence in Djibouti and the emerging facilities in Cambodia create new obligations and new potential flashpoints. The currency architecture being built around the Renminbi requires, if it is ever to achieve genuine reserve status, a degree of financial openness that the Chinese Communist Party has historically been deeply unwilling to embrace. Because real reserve currency status is functionally incompatible with the kind of tight capital controls Beijing currently maintains. The domestic pressures, the property crisis, the demographic contraction, the deflationary dynamic, the debt accumulation do not disappear because the foreign policy looks confident. They compound quietly, below the surface of official statistics and diplomatic statements, in the same way the British industrial decline compounded quietly below the surface of the pound sterling's continued global circulation. Britain's fatal error was a failure of perception. It confused the appearance of power with the substance of power for long enough that by the time the confusion was no longer sustainable, the window for structural adjustment had closed. The appearance of Chinese power today is real and formidable. The Belt and Road infrastructure is being built. The military presence is being quietly extended. The Renminbi's international role is slowly growing. The diplomatic relationships across the global south are deepening. All of this is visible and documented and consequential. What is less visible, and what history suggests, is the more important question, is whether the internal economic foundations of all that external ambition are as solid as the external ambition implies. Britain in 1900 did not feel like a nation in decline. Its navy was unmatched. Its currency was unchallenged. Its administrators governed a quarter of the planet. The empire that had taken a century to build looked, from the inside, as if it had been built to last forever. By 1950, it was gone. History does not repeat itself in every specific detail, But the structural logic of imperial overextension has proven remarkably consistent across different civilizations, different centuries, and different technological contexts. The pattern of build, expand, overextend, and decline, with the internal contradictions invisible until they become unavoidable, is not a British invention. It is something closer to a historical law. And right now, from sufficient altitude, the current map of Chinese global strategy and the historical map of the British Empire at the beginning of its long decline are rhyming in ways that deserve far more serious attention than they are currently receiving. The most powerful empire the world has ever seen did not see it coming. That is perhaps the most important thing the British Empire left behind. Not the railways, not the ports, not the legal systems or the trading networks or the global reach of the English language. The most important thing it left behind is the record of what it got wrong. And that record is there, documented and available for anyone willing to look at it honestly. If you made it to the end of this one, leave a compass in the comments. Because you just found the direction that very few people in power are willing to look. And if this kind of deep historical pattern analysis is something you find valuable, please subscribe to the channel. We are building something here. A body of work that connects the history of how power actually operates to the world we are all navigating right now. Every single subscriber genuinely matters. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.